Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Blumenthal, and I'm Director of Asian Studies here at AEI. And thank you all for coming here. I can see that the topic of U.S. and Southeast Asia is of great interest, and I congratulate my colleague Mike Mazza for a wonderful report that hopefully all of you will have time to read about what our strategy should be going forward in that most critical of regions. But it is right now my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Randy Schriver, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Affairs at Department of Defense, and is really spearheading efforts in the Department of Defense and throughout the government to really compete more vigorously with China in Southeast Asia, to build out new relationships with respect to Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines. He's already done some excellent work with his team here as well, and we'll do a lot more in the future. And we're just thrilled to have him to open up this session with his remarks. So without further ado, let me call up Randy Schriver. Where are you, Randy? There you are. Thank you.
Dan, thank you. It's great to be back at AEI, and really nice to be introduced by my friend Dan Blumenthal, one of the, I think, leading strategic thinkers of this generation, who does great work here on Asia at AEI. And let me add my congratulations. I didn't see where he went to. There he goes. Mike had a chance to look at the report, which is now public, and I want to congratulate you on that work. There's many aspects that I would commend. Certainly just the project itself, acknowledging the importance of this region, 635 million people, that counts, that matters. But your report identifies a lot of the historical engagement over time and the importance over time. But you also identify what I think is the core challenge, which is the threat to the American-led international order and the potential erosion of individual state sovereignty given the challenges in the region. And I think your recommendations are also very sound and aligned with our policy, your suggested whole-of-government, comprehensive approach with security, economic, and governance pillars, seeking to shape a region at peace with itself and its neighbors, characterized by states that are strong, independent, and prosperous, and governments that are resilient, responsive, and accountable. I wanted to read your language and your words because I think they're very well aligned with our strategy. Elements of our strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, have been publicly articulated, of course. Recently, Secretary Mattis spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June to talk about the defense and security aspects of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Many of you probably saw last week a major event at the Chamber of Commerce, the Indo-Pacific Business Forum. Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Perry, USAID Director Green, all talked about the economic development and energy aspects of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So much has been articulated in public. I don't need to go through all of that, but I thought I would use the brief time I have today to talk about how we see Southeast Asia in the context of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So consistent with Mike's report, we seek to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific region where nations with diverse cultures and different aspirations can prosper side by side in freedom, peace, and stability. By free, we mean nations will be free from coercion and able to protect their sovereignty. At the national level, we mean that societies are increasingly free in terms of good governance and fundamental human rights and liberties. By open, we mean that all nations can enjoy freedom of the seas and airways, and that all share a commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes. We also mean free means more open investment environments, and improved connectivity that drive regional integration and prosperity. Southeast Asia lies at the heart of the Indo-Pacific region, and thus arguably Southeast Asia and the maritime domain are areas where these concepts are most challenged. Southeast Asia, we think, therefore, has much to gain from the successful advancement of our vision and our strategy. While the U.S. has long recognized the importance of Southeast Asia as evidenced by our longstanding security partnerships and alliances, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Our interests are growing alongside the growth and importance of the region as a whole, particularly the security and economic aspects. So as a result, we're increasing our meaningful engagement with Southeast Asia. So let me address DoD's role in that. Secretary Mattis is personally committed to this region. He's visited the Indo-Pacific region 7 times as Secretary of Defense, including 4 times to Southeast Asia. He also believes in a strong investment in ASEAN-led institutions, such as the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. The ADMM Plus is a particular focus for the department. And right now, currently, the United States is co-chairing an expert-level working group on humanitarian affairs, disaster relief with Malaysia. Our routine military presence in the Indo-Pacific is a vital source of regional stability and serves as an important demonstration of our serious commitment to the region. Freedom of navigations, or FONOPs, are the most visible part of that, but we're engaged in activities, exercises, and operations across the region every day. The U.S. military is active on a daily basis to safeguard freedom of navigation and overflight in the Indo-Pacific, demonstrating our commitment to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. In these activities, we're joined by other like-minded countries who are concerned about growing challenges to international law, international norms, and a rules-based order. We're also engaged in capacity-building efforts, and in this we're joined by like-minded key allies, such as Japan and Australia, to build capacity of our Southeast Asian allies and partners to defend their sovereignty and their independence. For example, we provided extensive counterterrorism support to our Filipino allies, both during and in the aftermath of the battle with the Islamic State-linked militants in the city of Marawi. We've also helped build Vietnam's maritime capacity by providing a high-endurance cutter through excess defense articles, and we've boosted a burgeoning defense relationship with many activities and engagements, including the first aircraft carrier visit to Vietnam earlier this year to Da Nang. We're ramping up our security assistance to Southeast Asia, both through new programs like the Maritime Security Initiative, as well as through long-standing programs such as foreign military financing. Through MSI, we're providing the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand enhanced ability to sense, share, and contribute to maritime security and maritime domain awareness, with the ultimate goal having a credible regional maritime picture and therefore the ability to maintain freedom of maneuver. In MSI's first 3 years, we focused on enhancing information sharing, interoperability, and multinational maritime cooperation. With respect to foreign military financing, at the recent ASEAN Regional Forum, Secretary Pompeo announced over $290 million in foreign military financing to strengthen maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and peacekeeping capabilities in the Indo-Pacific to include Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. We also use our defense relationships around the region to increase capabilities through exercises, both bilateral and multilateral. Last year, we hosted the first U.S.-ASEAN Maritime Domain Awareness exercise, and this year we are expecting to repeat that and to expand the scope of that exercise. This year, the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Coast Guard are hosting the first U.S.-ASEAN Maritime Dialogue. We've also resumed full participation in our flagship exercises with our Southeast Asian allies, Cobra Gold with Thailand and Balakatan with the Philippines, and we're continuing to increase the complexity of our training across the region. We're committed to even deeper engagement with Southeast Asia, but we also cannot ignore where our humanitarian concerns will create political constraints on the pace and scope of that engagement. In Burma, we have serious concerns about their trajectory. The ethnic cleansing campaign in the Rakhine State is a repugnant stain on the military and those elements involved in that campaign, and rightfully will impact our thinking. As we look at the overall political picture there, we're concerned about the case of the 2 Reuters journalists who are on trial for their coverage of the Rakhine State. Convicting innocent journalists would certainly cast grave doubt on the rule of law and the future of democracy in Myanmar. In Cambodia, we're also concerned about the trends. After Cambodia's sham election last week, the White House expressed, quote, profound disappointment and caution that steps may be taken in response to that election. In the meantime, Cambodia should immediately release opposition leader Kem Sokha. Hun Sen's wrongful imprisonment of Kem is causing great stress and leading to his deteriorating health. As is the case with Burma, there appears to be little foundation for quality military and security relationship when the Cambodian military is being used to threaten the people of Cambodia who are seeking a voice in their political future. Overall, we're doing a great deal in Southeast Asia and are confident that we are well positioned for the long-term strategic competition that is unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region. Our strategy is an affirmative, positive one, and it's inclusive. And while it's not aimed at any particular country, there should be little doubt that much of the Chinese behavior is demonstrating objectives that run counter to our objectives for a free and open Indo-Pacific. We seek a positive, results-oriented military and security relationship with Beijing, but Chairman Xi Jinping and the CCP need to understand that while we seek cooperation where our interests align, we will confront and compete where we must. We often hear that countries in the region do not want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and China. And while we understand that concern, this is not a choice that we would have the people of Southeast Asia contemplate. As we look at the growing data set of Chinese predatory economic statecraft and more assertive behavior that includes militarization of the South China Sea and an attempt to operationalize an unlawful sovereignty claim, the choices are clear, not between being in one camp or another camp, but of two vastly different aspirations. So the choice is really between partnership or domination, independence and self-reliance or a mortgaged future, full sovereignty or coercion, international law and norms or irredentis claims and control. Southeast Asia will remain central to our thinking as to how to best implement this administration's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and will continue to build on our already strong relationships there to shape a region in which all nations can enjoy freedom, peace, and prosperity. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Congratulations again to Mike and AEI, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. We have, how much time do you have for questions?
Tell me, what do we?
Okay,
a half hour
please state your name and affiliation and ask a question, please. Don't try to smuggle in a comment. We'll call that out. We know how to do that here. So yes, you in the back. Go ahead. You.
Thank you.
Yeah, wait for the mic also.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'd like to ask you to specify the word confront when you said that we will confront China for any illegal actions in the South China Sea. What does that involve? Secondly, I would like to ask about the situation of Vietnam and its proposed laws of the special economic zones of the three very strategic posts in the South China Sea along Vietnam, which is Vân Đồn, Bac Vân Phong, and Phu Quoc in Kiên Giang. Those are very strategic marine coast. What do you think the U.S. actions can be economic goal-wise, partnership-wise, and also inclusively with ASEAN? Thank you.
On the first question about confronting China, I would simply relay what our senior officials have said across the table to their Chinese interlocutors. It's when China challenges these concepts of open and free Indo-Pacific, as we're seeing in the South China Sea. And confront can take a variety of forms. It sounds a bit aggressive, but for example, the decision to disinvite from RIMPAC, I think, is a form of confronting China's behavior because it was linked directly to the militarization of those outposts in the South China Sea that led to that decision. And when the Chinese were informed of our decision, it was linked to those activities. So again, where we see these concepts, where international law, international norms, free and open Indo-Pacific are challenged, I think you'll find the United States and probably many other countries side by side in confronting that behavior or those activities. On your second question, I'm afraid I'm not very well versed on these special economic zones. I think as a general matter, we're bullish on building out our partnership with Vietnam. There's a lot happening in the defense space. I mentioned the aircraft carrier. I mentioned the excess defense article, the Coast Guard cutter. We're looking to partner even more in the space of maritime security and maritime domain awareness. I think the economic component of that relationship is very important as well. Secretary Pompeo was there not long ago and discussed the full range of our relationship, so I'll leave it at that.
In the yellow jacket right there, and then we have one up here too.
Eunjung Cho with the Voice of America. When does DoD plan to resume joint military exercises with ROK? Because North Korea is not taking any substantial denuclearization actions right now, and this was supposed to be a goodwill gesture to prop up the diplomacy. Second question, when do you expect to resume the joint field operations to find out the remains from the North Korea? Would this be around next spring?
Thank you for your questions on Southeast Asia.
We're trying to pivot to Southeast Asia.
So the United States government has announced the suspension of one major military exercise, the Freedom Guardian exercise, and a couple of minor marine exchanges that involved amphibious landings. No other decisions have been made. No other announcements have been made. What we do in the future will depend on North Korean behavior, and we'll look to Secretary of State Pompeo and the President to give us a lead on their assessment of how the negotiations are going.
Let's go up here. One question, please.
Hi, Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. The recent, turning over of the port in Sri Lanka for 100 years has raised a lot of eyebrows. Are there any other strategic infrastructure programs you see in the region that you're concerned could be turned over to China in a similar way if the debt isn't repaid?
I think the lease was actually for 99 years, which is interesting because that's the same terms as Hong Kong was originally turned over. And so there's this irony of the deals the Chinese are striking now versus their own history, which they often express grave concern about their treatment in the past. We're mindful of Chinese activities throughout the Indo-Pacific region and where they're looking to invest through the Belt and Road Initiative and where their military is trying to engage in defense military diplomacy. And I would not want to sort of start calling out a number of countries, but we've seen where there are stressed economies, where there's political disruption in terms of backsliding from political liberalization or democracy. When some of these core elements are in place, the Chinese can be very opportunistic and move in. So our approach shouldn't necessarily be to be blaming the Chinese for having a strategy. They have a strategy. We need to offer alternatives, sometimes on our own, sometimes in partnership with other countries. Think about our own strategic port calls. Think about our own investment in bilateral military relations. Think about the full range of activities we can bring to bear. And I think when it comes to the economic aspects, I would look again at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum last week, where people like Secretary Pompeo and USAI Director Green talked about the difference in how we approach development assistance, the difference in how we invest in countries. We ultimately, if it's AID, we want them to graduate. And if you look at the long history of AID, a large percentage of recipient countries are now independent of assistance and enjoy strong economies and sovereignty. Same is true of our economic partnerships through trade and investment. We want those countries to be stronger, prosperous, and more independent and have sovereign control. That's in stark contrast to how the Chinese approach things.
I think in the back, in the red over there, was next in line. One question, please.
Sure. Thank you. Rita Chen from Central News Agency, Taiwan. My question is about Asia. The Assistant Secretary, you just mentioned the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative that Secretary Pompeo announced last week. I'm just wondering that from DoD's perspective, how will you strengthen the maritime security in the region? And with regard to the humanitarian assistance, is Taiwan play any role with this regard? And with regard to the rule-based system, do you think that Americans should join the CPTPP? Thank you.
So the first question. I'm actually, after the third or fourth, I got, the first question was about,
How will the United States strengthen the maritime security?
so we do have programs such as the Maritime Security Initiative that contribute to capacity building, in some cases in partnership with our State Department colleagues. These are investments in actual material, things that, radars, things that support maritime domain awareness. In some cases, it's the training. In some cases, the organization assisting with how they organize and approach maritime security. So we are a partner with our State Department in these efforts. And I think, again, our flagship program being the Maritime Security Initiative. Again, I'm sort of forgetting the second, third follow-on questions.
Okay.
But I know there was something about Taiwan in there. We think Taiwan is an important contributor to the Indo-Pacific free and open concepts. It certainly demonstrates the free part in terms of, as we say, internal, the good governance, democracy, respect for humanitarian rights, religious freedom. We think that those values, there's a role for Taiwan to uphold those values throughout the region in particular ways. Taiwan has a great record historically on humanitarian affairs, disaster relief, many times through its NGOs, and I think it's to our benefit to think creatively, given our non-diplomatic relationship, think creatively how we can continue to partner with Taiwan to promote those values.
I'm going to just demonstrate how one question was asked. My name is Dan Blumenthal. I'm with AEI. You served as in the State Department and as a naval officer. What has changed the most in your mind since you came back to serve in government?
Well, let's see. I left government in 2005, so it's a much different China, more powerful, more capable, more assertive. So both on the capability side and in the behavior side, I think that's probably the biggest difference. I would add, I think we have, and maybe these two are linked, but if that's true, so be it. We have allies, partners, and other countries that themselves are more capable and more willing to be active in the region. It's a very different Japan than 13 years ago when I last served in government. Very different Australia, and very different New Zealand in a lot of ways. I think the value of partnering with the United States in promoting a rules-based order, international law, international norms is widely held and widely seen, and countries understand that there's a burden for them to share, and that's another evolution, I guess I would say.
Thank you. This gentleman right here.
My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Heritage Foundation. Regarding South China Sea, the island creation is one thing, but militarization is a different story, different ballgame. That's number one. Number two, I am not so sure if...
One question, please.
Okay. Our satellite imagery project, is it sufficient or not?
How are we going to deal with the militarization of South China Sea?
Well, the militarization is problematic. It goes against a pledge that Xi Jinping made in the Rose Garden 2015 with President Obama. It's also a problem because it's associated with an unlawful sovereignty claim that's very expansive and I think would threaten the rules-based international norms that all countries benefit from. And it's not just the militarization, it's the increasing behavior where we see more shadowing and harassment, where we see cautionary notes about how transits are made by military vessels. So this is of great concern. We've taken what was described at the time as an initial step, which was disinviting China from RIMPAC. Symbolic, perhaps, but important because it was linked to those activities, and it was stated that RIMPAC and the spirit of that exercise, China's activities are inconsistent with it. I think what you'll see is certainly a continuation of freedom of navigation. I think you'll see perhaps more countries joining in presence activities, which, if not a 12 nautical mile challenge, presence in the South China Sea is very important because China claims the whole thing through the 9-dash line. And I think you'll potentially see more cost imposition, even if it's not directly on point. We don't have to do something in the South China Sea per se to express our concern about what China's doing in the South China Sea themselves. I think in terms of our ability to monitor it, and you asked about satellites, I think it is sufficient. I think one thing we want to do is make more information public, shine a light on this activity so that there's no doubt, and occasionally we run into challenges with declassifying things and doing it quickly enough, but over time I think we want a light shined on this behavior because it is of concern to everyone in the region.
Got it. Nadia was next, and then Roger will be after that. Why don't we take both one question from each because we're running out of time.
Hi, Randy. Thank you for engaging the dialogue again. The Defense Authorization Bill just passed by the Congress has some language specifically on Taiwan. I just wonder, from the administration's point of view, how are you going to execute, like a medical ship visit to Taiwan and a high-level visit and the routine arms sales to Taiwan? Thank you.
Roger, go ahead.
Roger Cliff of the Center for Naval Analyses. I have a harder question. You talked a little bit about protecting the sovereignty and independence of countries in the region, and of course it is China's, that's the external actor, that's the most threat to this. And we talked a little bit about ways of confronting the more overt things that China's been doing. What about some of the more covert things that they're doing in terms of effectively neutralizing the governments of certain countries in Southeast Asia, or trying to leverage the Chinese diaspora throughout the region to influence the policies of those countries? Thank you.
So first on the NDAA and some of the Taiwan provisions, I think, first of all, we're still reviewing. The NDA just passed not long ago, last week or recently. We're still reviewing all the provisions. If it's a statement of congressional intent, we certainly acknowledge that it's a point of interest for Congress, and there's always been strong support for Taiwan there. The things you mentioned, potential hospital ship visit, high-level exchanges, to my knowledge, those are things that we have the latitude to do under the Taiwan Relations Act, under the current construct of the relationship. So we'll take a look and see if the NDAA adds to that or merely supports it. But I don't have any comment on future plans, what we might do. But I do regard congressional action through the NDAA as a strong statement of their interest and where their support lies. On the more, you use the term covert aspects of China's influence operations in Asia and Southeast Asia. Again, I think similarly, continuing to shine a light on what China does is the first step, because I think when these things are exposed, there's often a backlash, and we certainly saw that in Australia when much of those activities were published through the good work of people like John Garneau. I think we saw that in Vanuatu when there was a press story about potential economic leverage being used to gain port access. Whether that was a factually correct story or not, it created a backlash in Vanuatu. I think we're learning more and more about the situation in Malaysia, that it's much worse than people even expected. And I think Mahathir is planning to travel to China to talk about getting out from under some of this debt and maybe renegotiate. But I think our position can be to remind Malaysia that they have leverage here too, if they can expose some of these corrupt deals and how China uses these predatory practices to gain influence in ways that run against the interests of the domestic population. And then I think we have to be more skilled or more clever about our own engagement. We're not going to do what China does, but strengthening our own narrative about what it means to partner with the U.S. in a variety of ways. Our engagement and our partnership ultimately leads to self-reliance and independence and protection of sovereignty, not the erosion of it. And our cultural exchanges and our American centers and things of that nature are for the genuine promotion of ties, not for the for the subversion of the other country. So, continuing to show what the clear choices are, I think, is part of the exercise as well, and having that alternative known to partner countries.
We've run out of time, but I am going to take the moderator's last question. How would you measure success? Dan Blumenthal, AAI. How would you measure success, let's say, in the course of one or two administrations?
Well, I think, again, China has a strategy, and to think we're going to accomplish major rollback and change of behavior, I think would be pretty optimistic. I think it's something we should work at, because I think China's interests will ultimately lie in a free and open Indo-Pacific that they can benefit from as well. But I think in the near term, it's really to blunt any erosion of an individual country's sovereignty, blunt the coercion and influence operations, and to continue to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific in a way that generates a positive response. I think the measures will be countries wanting to partner with us in more comprehensive ways. We know countries welcome our investment. We outpace China in terms of foreign direct investment in virtually every country in the Indo-Pacific. But continuing to partner with us in promoting maritime security, partner with us through diplomatic fora when it comes to calling out activities in the South China Sea, et cetera. So I think the real metrics will be in the partnerships we develop. You mentioned Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. You could add India. You could add a number of countries that I might characterize as emerging partnerships. Maybe Philippines is a little different. It's a longstanding treaty ally, but non-allied countries that are emerging partners. There are certainly things we'll be able to develop, see, measure that will indicate we have closer partnership on these issues that I'm talking about here today.
Well, Randy, thank you very much, and thank you for your service. And we all know we're benefiting greatly as a country from your leadership on these issues at DoD, and good luck in the future. And obviously, AI and many other think tanks stand ready to help in any way we can. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll talk later. We're going to move to Mike Mazza on the moderated panel. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Dan Blumenthal from AI, and I would like to introduce the panel first. We have a very distinguished group that I've been privileged to work with for a while. Kara Abercrombie is a long-time Defense Department civil servant who's been working on India relationship before it was cool. I don't know if it's cool now, but before it was cool. And a lot of the Southeast Asian countries also for a long time, and is currently a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, where she's been researching and writing. She'll comment on Mike's report from a defense angle, and Walter Lohman, a good friend and colleague who has done long service in Southeast Asia as the president of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council for a time, and under Senator McCain, who's always been a leader of Southeast Asia policy, who will be commenting more on the economic and political aspects of let's call it the Mazza Southeast Asia strategy. And then Mike Mazza, who's been with us at AI for a decade, worked his way up the ladder, the hard work up here to become an independent scholar. and put out excellent reports like this. And let's open it up first to Mike just to speak for a few minutes before we do some moderated questions. So go ahead, Mike.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the kind intro. Just a few quick words of thanks before diving into the strategy. Randy's already left, but a big thank you to Randy for being here today and helping us launch this report. I wanted to thank Dan and Sadanand Doom, who I don't see here, AI colleagues who have provided advice and guidance on this project from concept paper I wrote several years ago up through planning the event today. I also want to thank 3 research assistants who assisted on this over the course of the project. Eddie Linzer, who's now on Capitol Hill, Olivia Schriver, who's now our research program manager in Foreign Policy Department here, and Annie Kawaluski, who's our current research assistant. All of them helped with grant writing, with research editing, managing the publication process, and again, planning the event today. And without their efforts, we wouldn't be sitting here today. And finally, I want to thank Kara and Walter for being here, and for being here on relatively short notice. They both have much deeper experience and deeper knowledge of the region than I do, so I really look forward to hearing what you have to say and finding out where I went very wrong. And with that, I'll dive into the presentation here. I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. So if there are questions about specifics that I don't dive into, hopefully we can get into that in the Q&A. First off, I just wanted to talk about why the region matters. When you look at the Obama administration, for example, did what I would argue was a lot of positive things, deepening engagement on a bilateral basis in the region and with ASEAN, but never really explaining why Southeast Asia was such a focus within the broader pivot or rebalance to Asia. And I don't think the Trump administration has quite answered that question yet either. To my mind, there's 4 big reasons why we care about Southeast Asia. First is its geostrategic centrality. As Secretary Pompeo described last week, it sits literally in the center of the map of the region that we're now calling the Indo-Pacific. Key shipping lanes run through Southeast Asian waters, which are important both for trade, but also for global power projection from the United States, but from others as well. And the region acts as either a buffer or a link between India and China and between Australia and Asia's major powers as well. It's also home to natural resources, which have been crucial to Southeast Asians' economic well-being, but to others as well. And that's been true for centuries. But natural resources aren't the only reason that the region is important for economic reasons. It has a large and growing population. The VIP countries in particular, that's Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, have younger populations with high GDP growth rates, and they have healthy demographic profiles. And with China potentially facing growing economic headwinds, Southeast Asia could be a potential driver of global growth in the decades ahead. The third, regional security challenges have global implications. We've heard a lot about the South China Sea already today, and we're familiar, I think, with that challenge. Outside the South China Sea, Southeast Asia continues to face challenges of terrorism and insurgency. As we know well at this point, localized extremism can have effects outside the region. And then there's non-traditional security challenges as well, things like piracy, transnational crime, natural disasters, which again can have wide-ranging effects. As one example, a severe flooding in Thailand several years ago had economic effects far outside Thailand's borders. And finally, the region is important to the United States for reasons of governance and human rights. American statesmen have long recognized that the stability that the strongman provides ultimately proves illusory, that unfree societies may achieve some economic success, but will not achieve the levels of economic dynamism that they might wish, and that good governance is not truly possible when a citizenry has little say in how it's governed. These are things the United States has essentially always cared about, and for that reason, Southeast Asia will continue to draw interest going forward. Given that, what should U.S. goals be? What's a long-term vision look like? And there's 3 points that I would make. First, I think the U.S. should seek to shape a Southeast Asia that's at peace with its neighbors, Southeast Asia in which states interact peacefully with one another, and in which open access to the global commons is assured. Secondly, the United States should seek to shape a Southeast Asia that embraces free market economics, that's more deeply integrated with global trade and financial flows, and is integrated in such a way that leads to growing prosperity within Southeast Asia. And third, of course, the U.S. should always support the democratic aspirations of Southeast Asian peoples and should be ready to support and assist states transitioning to more liberal forms of government. But change, of course, rarely happens overnight. And then in the medium term, I think the United States needs to be content to seek to shape a Southeast Asia in which governments are at least resilient, responsive, and accountable. I think pursuing this vision would advance the Trump administration's goal of defending the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think a free and open Southeast Asia is crucial if the United States wants to achieve its broader goals in the region. So that being said, what does a strategy look like? I described three pillars, as Randy noted earlier, security, economic, and governance pillars. And again, I'll work through this quickly. But before diving into sort of the traditional security questions, I wanted to ask a question about ASEAN, which is what do we do about that organization? There's been a lot of frustration here in the United States in recent years, I think, given its inability to act as any sort of strategic counterweight to China, its inability to find consensus on a more robust response in the South China Sea to China's activity there. And there's been some questions about whether it's worth the American effort. And I think it is. And I'll make 4 quick points about why ASEAN matters and how the United States can effectively engage. First, fairly or not, U.S. engagement with ASEAN is seen as a litmus test for our commitment in Southeast Asia. And it's seen that way by U.S. allies and partners as well. And that may be inconvenient, but it's a fact we have to deal with. Secondly, ASEAN provides opportunities for valuable theatrics. It's useful for a Secretary of State or Defense or the President to go out to the region to attend these summits and make declaratory statements of U.S. interests and U.S. policy. That's not sufficient. We need to, of course, see action follow words, but the words matter. Third, I do think ASEAN is a useful forum through which the United States can help tackle and contribute to combating transnational crime issues. So, for example, all ASEAN states have committed to tackling human trafficking, and they're open to assistance in doing so, and we're engaged with ASEAN in providing resources and providing training to tackle that challenge. And fourth, I do think that by working within and through ASEAN, the United States can take the reins when it needs to on some of the more traditional security challenges that we face in the region, including the South China Sea. And I was happy to hear Randy talk about the importance of the ADMM+, because I think it's a forum that we can get greater use out of. And in particular, I argue in the report that we should look into forming a subgrouping within the ADMM+ of like-minded states with whom we can coordinate ahead of major summits. We can coordinate approaches to the South China Sea and other pressing security matters. We could call it a maritime security caucus. Again, it's something that I think there's openness to within the region because we would be working through ASEAN rather than outside of the organization, which China increasingly is doing, by the way, and which is looked at unfavorably by the ASEAN states. Given that, what do we do about the South China Sea? Again, I'll go through this very quickly, but I describe a two-pronged approach in the report, dissuasion and diplomacy. So first, dissuasion. We want to dissuade China from doing any further island building, from deploying significant military forces to the region, and from engaging in other sorts of provocative and certainly aggressive behavior. How do we do that? I think there's 3 ways we can do that. China essentially has paid no costs over the past 4 or 5 years for its behavior there. And I think we can start imposing some costs. And I think there's reason to do so, again, as Randy described, outside of the South China Sea. Chinese activities there are challenging what we might call core American interests. And it's useful and makes sense to respond in ways that demonstrate that. Secondly, we can do more within the South China Sea. In particular, I think we need to work on enhancing our military presence and our military posture. Right now, we're limited to bases in the Philippines and access arrangements in Singapore. My own view is that's simply not sufficient. We need more access in more places across the sea. And third, and related to that, if we want to reshape the security landscape in our favor and in our partners' favor, we need to continue prioritizing building partnership capacity. And again, I was happy to hear Randy talk about this as well. I don't think there's much more to say about it at this point in time, but I would say, one thing that I think it's time that we really start pursuing aggressively is a regional maritime domain awareness network. We at AEI have been pushing this idea for probably 8 years or so. Others in Washington have been writing about it as well. It's hard work, it's complicated, but it's potentially a very useful way to deter all parties, all interested parties in South China Sea from engaging in particularly provocative or destabilizing acts. On the diplomatic front, I think what's required here is really the U.S. to exercise leadership in a way that it has not in the past, and do so in a way that sets us on a path towards actually resolving rather than just managing these conflicts. And again, this is an argument that Dan and I made in an op-ed for the first time 3 or 4 years ago. The idea would be to launch a new diplomatic process involving claimants, which would set out to set standards for conduct, to agree on parameters for resource of development, and to move over time towards eventual border delimitation. China would be welcome, but we would also be ready to move forward without China. Again, no bones about it, this is an enormously complicated thing to do, but it's worth pursuing if we want to, again, change the security landscape in the region in our favor. I think Southeast Asian states that are claimants can be brought along if they are convinced of U.S. commitment, and there are a number of steps we can take to do that, and I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Southeast Asia, of course, is also repeatedly stricken by the scourge of terrorism. There's ongoing insurgencies across the region. I'll just focus on one thing in particular in my remarks here. I think the Trump administration was right last fall to reinstitute a named operation in the southern Philippines following the events in Marawi over the previous several months. It's important that we match that with civilian resources. When we were successful in the Philippines somewhat during the first decade of the 2000s, this was a combined military and civilian effort in order to bring better security, peace, and stability to the southern Philippines. I'd also like to see us use this operation as a means to enhance cooperation with third parties. So, for example, bringing Indonesian special forces, counter-terror police over to the southern Philippines both for classroom sessions with United States and Philippine special forces, but also giving them an opportunity to observe us operating together in the field. This can enhance the capabilities of all three, but also begin to build some of the institutional and person-to-person ties between U.S. and Indonesian special forces, which are missing at this time. And finally, non-traditional security threats. I don't have much to say there. Essentially, I argue that we should keep doing what we're doing. We're always in the lead, or frequently in the lead, when it comes to natural disaster response. We're very good at it. Our Pacific Pathways program, in which we train others to do it, is very successful. And we're engaged on combating transnational crime as well. And again, I think we just keep doing what we're doing there going forward. So on the economic front, we need a trade agenda for Southeast Asia. Secretary Pompeo, in his speech last week, said that we would be welcoming bilateral trade agreements with states in the region. But thus far, there's not evidence that that's actually a priority for this administration, and I think it needs to be. And one way to go about doing this, and this borrows from an argument that Dan and our colleague Derek Scissors made, is to actually start with Japan. The TPP negotiations laid a foundation for the United States and Japan to move relatively quickly if they want to do so on their own trade agreement. And in particular, they can set high standards and easily set high standards on state-owned enterprises and on intellectual property protections, which we can then take to Southeast Asian partners and make clear that these are what we consider benchmarks for agreements with them going forward. I think we start with the Philippines. They've already done some of the very hard work of identifying the steps they would have needed to take were they to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Duterte brought this up with President Trump last fall. They're interested and serious about, I think, deepening trade, and so that's where I'd start. Vietnam desperately wants more access to U.S. textile and footwear markets, and then we should be open to follow-on agreements with Malaysia and Indonesia and others. Ideally, we'd see a series of high-quality, high-standard bilateral FTAs, or perhaps even the evolution of the U.S.-Japan agreement into a broader regional framework. Regarding multilateral efforts, I'll just talk briefly here about infrastructure investment. Secretary Pompeo, again, last week announced a new U.S. initiative here. Beyond that, I think we want to be working much more closely with U.S. allies and partners and encouraging to coordinate amongst themselves. We're seeing the beginnings of some of this work, but more needs to be done going forward. Basically, we want to make sure that China is not the only game in town in Southeast Asia when it comes to infrastructure investments. That they can go to the Asian Development Bank, that they can go to the World Bank, that they can go to other partners who have an interest in supporting these types of investments. We're not going to match China dollar for dollar, but we can provide options which others will be welcoming of. And finally, on the question of governance, the challenge in advancing towards a freer future in Southeast Asia is a diverse one. There's not a one-size-fits-all American approach to the region. I think this points to an ambitious long-term end state. Of course, we want to see liberal democracies across the region where human rights are respected and defended. But we may have to settle for more short-term goals. And in the short term, and again, this depends a bit on the country in question, but in the short term, I think we focus on governance over democratization per se. Improved governance would lead to stronger economies over the long term, and importantly, dampen the potential influence of Chinese and other dirty money. And I think we do this by tackling transnational crime. Again, countries in the region have all committed to some extent to tackling things like human trafficking in wildlife, narcotics. But if they are serious about doing so, there will need to be improvements in rule of law. Corruption will need to be dealt with in a serious fashion. We'll need more professional criminal justice systems. This is sort of a backdoor, bank shot approach to getting at some of the governance issues that we care about, and doing so in a way that will be more amenable to states in the region. In the report, I do a country-by-country, essentially, approach to how we want to focus on governance. I'm not going to go through that here, but we are able to shape a region where governments are more resilient and responsive and accountable. I think that's in the interests of the United States and certainly in the interests of Southeast Asian peoples as well. And that's where I'll wrap up.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And I encourage everyone to read the report for it's quite rich in its detail. But let me, I know you have some prepared comments, but I'm going to throw you off by asking some questions. Walter, let's start with you. Let's say the Mike's agenda is basically right. The Trump administration has decided to fix relations with some of the dictatorships in Thailand and the Philippines, and approach that as a I guess higher diplomatic and security concern right now than some of the human rights issues, because arguably China made so much progress in encroaching in that region beforehand. Do you think that's the right approach?
I do think it's the right approach in those two cases, that is with the Philippines and Thailand. I think you need to be operating on a sort of sliding scale on these things. I'm all for pressing for human rights concerns across the board in all of the countries, but the way you do it, I think, has to be different in each. I mean, for instance, Cambodia and Burma, I think they're taking the right approach there too, pressing pretty hard on the human rights issues. But when you look at Thailand and you look at the Philippines, you've got to weigh the other benefits that they offer, and both offer a tremendous amount of value to the United States as allies. And so I think the way you approach the issues, like in the Philippines, is the way our ambassador is now, mostly behind closed doors. Similar in Thailand with private.
Let me just stick with Walter for another couple minutes here. On the economic approach, obviously, for those of you who watch Monty Python, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is dead. It's not just resting. It's been dead for a very long time. Arguably, it's been dead as soon as it was given to the House Republicans to run it through. But that's not a debate for today. So Secretary Pompeo put out a speech together with a whole set of cabinet, not just a speech, but a strategy with a whole set of cabinet officials that essentially the approach right now is to catalyze private capital into the region. And I think they're correct in saying that there's no amount of government money that can meet the infrastructure needs of Southeast Asia. The question is twofold. One is we probably need more than that. We probably need to start negotiating at least bilateral investment treaties to improve market conditions in those countries. But the other problem, I think, is just the corruption within those countries. And what in the world do we do? So the first question is, what do you make of this economic approach? And the second one is these issues of just China being able to go into some of these countries and just engage in pure corruption, bribery to win contracts versus U.S. private investment or multinational private investment.
Well, I really liked Pompeo's speech last week. I think he identified exactly the way that we need to compete with China. The messaging was slightly off, I think, in terms of identifying the resources that we're investing there. I'm not sure it was a good idea to state the amount because it's really not an apples-to-apple comparison with what the Chinese are doing. So by saying the amount, you open the door for it to be looked at that way. Right. And Wang Yi, on cue, did basically mock or taunt, however you want to look at it, Pompeo for doing that. But I do think the approach is exactly right. We have to be able to unlock the power of the U.S. private sector even more than we have so far, because as Randy pointed out, we're much bigger investors in Southeast Asia than the Chinese are already. So that is the way we have to go about it, and we just have to message it in the right way. But I also agree with Mike that we need a trade policy. So that's one part of it, but that is not going to get you all the way. We need a trade policy, and we don't really have a trade policy in Southeast Asia. There is the prospect of free trade agreements with Philippines, also with Thailand. Ambassador Lighthizer mentions at every opportunity those two. But a couple problems with it. One is we're not getting a whole lot of take-up on it. The Philippines is eager to do it, but so far it's just a matter of consultations. We're not really moving forward very quickly at it. And then the other problem is capacity. So when USTR, a small agency to begin with, is involved in renegotiating NAFTA, and Chorus is not fully done yet. I mean, they agreed on this agreement on principle several months ago, but still hasn't been finished. And if I'm in Seoul, I'm waiting for the auto tariff decision to be decided before I actually sign that agreement. So that could be another drain on time very soon. So I just don't see much activity going on there. And I also agree that Japan would be a good model, be a good place to start, but we also have a problem there in that the Japanese don't want to do it. So we've got to come up with an attractive picture for trade and a broader economic relationship in order to best sell this vision that Pompeo was offering last week. And so far, we're not offering that compelling vision. If you go back and look at the president's speech at APEC, that was not the way to do it. Okay, he basically said, okay, you all are cheaters and liars and you're screwing us. But if you behave yourself, we might do an FTA if it benefits us more than it does you. I mean, who's going to buy that? So we need a compelling vision in which to house all of these different aspects.
But there is this question, maybe not raised as artfully as possible, which is it's hard to compete when the countries themselves are not engaged in their own market reforms, investment protections, and involved in corruption. So some of that is up to the countries themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is an issue. But, years ago when we already went through this process with Malaysia and Thailand and didn't come out the other side with a free trade agreement, the point was always made, they're not ready for it. The point is always made for the Filipinos, they're not ready for a free trade agreement because of these issues. But if we could make a free trade agreement with Mexico, I think we could deal with corruption in Thailand and elsewhere. Yeah. But I think it's a way to deal with it, and I also think we do script in reforms that are necessary in order to abide by the agreement. So the agreement is actually a spur to reform in those countries.
Okay. Kara, Is it over in the South China Sea? I mean, you go to any think tank forum and you'll get some of the same answers, which is we got to continue with, or we restarted the program of, to their credit, they restarted the robust program of freedom of navigation and others. But, so we can keep the freedom of navigation open. People will say cost and position, and there's only so much you can do, right? Capacity building. But, I mean, the Chinese essentially effectively control so much of it now. I guess except for the Scarborough Shoal. I mean, is it just, are we looking at this the wrong way? Was it a massive territorial change, bigger probably than Crimea, that there's just, or what can we do?
Thanks for the easy question, Dan.
Yeah.
Before I speak, I am obliged to tell you that I am speaking in my personal capacity representing the Carnegie Endowment and not the U.S.
That's
government.
why I didn't ask you
These
about
views
tariffs.
are my own. I would love to comment on that because I've never worked on tariffs personally. Look, I mean, I think it's evident that there's no going back to before, right? China effectively changed the facts on the ground. But to your question, is it over? I mean, what's changed is that they have expanded reefs, they've conducted incredible environmental damage, and they have militarized these features. That is a fact. And they are, as Randy pointed out, challenging ships that are passing by and planes that are flying overhead. So they are now, this is a daily occurrence. So that's all changed. But in terms of what we want, what our interest is in the South China Sea, which is the free flow of commerce, the ability for our military to transit peacefully, the ability for states to operate and make decisions free from coercion, that hasn't necessarily changed. And this is where, I hate to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think it's a fact. Upholding the rules-based order, the international norms that is being widely debated right now, frankly, in the think tank world and in academia. Was the liberal-based order ever so liberal and really international? But effectively,
it's time for you to go back to DoD.
I know, I'm sucked into academia. No, but it's served our interest and it served the interest of the countries of the region. It has provided peace and stability and prosperity for 70 years. It's a good thing. And so now is the time for not just the United States to be standing up and championing these roles, but also our partners and allies and like-minded countries in the region. So to Randy's point, the U.S. maintains a daily presence operationally in the South China Sea. We are seeing more of our partners and allies transiting and conducting presence operations. That is important in pushing back to any declaration that this is, one country's territory.
In terms of, with your vast government experience, in terms of operationalizing some of these issues involving maritime capacity building, Randy mentioned joint maritime domain awareness. How would you prioritize? How are these things actually actualized? There's the funding of money, obviously, but how are these things actually actualized in some of these very weak countries still?
Yeah. Certainly the easiest thing for us to do is just direct that U.S. ships unilaterally, conduct presence operations. That's very easy for us to do. We're just limited by requirements elsewhere. But in terms of really working with the countries in the region, this is where decades of partnering quietly to build relationships with countries, especially the maritime littorals in the region, pays off. We can have conversations with them about the importance of maritime domain awareness. We can show by example what it means to have a common operating picture. And so what we've been prioritizing now, and there are folks in the audience who've worked on this directly, I can see them, is helping do an assessment not just from a bilateral standpoint, what does each country need, but really holistically looking at the region as a whole, what would you need holistically to create for the maritime countries a common operating picture. And so it's making sure that if we're providing radars or ships with sensors that they can talk to each other. This, frankly, is not easy, even in the U.S. government, making sure that all of our different security cooperation offices are working well. But that's what we've been doing, and you've seen that effectively been building up over the past 3 years.
Some of these countries really cannot see in their 12 nautical miles, right? Or control anything in their exclusive economic zone. In let's say 3 years, do you see our ability to help them at least build those capacities? I'm talking Vietnam and the maritime countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines.
Absolutely, we're seeing improvement on a bilateral basis, independently with the Coast Watch Center in the Philippines, or working with Vietnam to improve some of their Coast Guard functions. Although their maritime, their EEZ is very, very long. So they've got a lot of work to do. I think that the harder piece will be the networking them together. The other hard piece that, frankly, is a challenge for us and for the countries in the region is who owns maritime domain awareness from a bureaucratic standpoint in each of these capitals? Is it the Coast Guard? Is it the Navy? Is it another civilian organization? And do they talk to each other? And so this has been sort of a learning process for everyone involved, but one, again, where relationships on the ground pay off and don't pay off.
I think that's so important because, oftentimes I think people look at Asia and they think NATO, right? And it's so far from even being able to, as you say, know who to talk to build out, the ability to have a Coast Guard, right? Walter, we're going to take question time too, right? Okay. Walter, this proposal that Mike has, and Carrie, you can comment on this too, that the U.S. should be more diplomatically creative and proactive and set up, without taking aside ASEAN centrality, set up some sort of maritime claimant caucus that actually offers them U.S. good offices to set their own disputes or resolve their own disputes. Do you think that's workable? Do you think we can get those countries together on the sidelines of one of these meetings?
Probably not. Only because, one, they have the capacity to do that already among themselves. But the other reason is because they will not respond well to an approach that is separate from the Chinese. I think in terms of diplomatic creativity, where we could do more is in interpretation of our treaty commitments, say in the case of the Philippines, applying those commitments specifically and explicitly to Philippine-occupied territory in the Spratlys, for existence. So, for example, so that's not saying all the Philippine claims, and it's not making a judgment on the Philippine claims. It's just saying where the Philippines are actually now, where they have forces, where they have people, a move on those islands would invoke the U.S. security commitments. Things like that, where we could be unilaterally or bilaterally more active on the diplomatic front, I think would be very valuable. But I don't think we'd have much of a chance of convening a group without the Chinese involved.
It was actually Secretary Clinton in 2010 who first offered the good offices of the United States to resolve disputes among, and I guess no one took them up on the offer. But one thing, and Carrie, you can comment too, you're obviously in government at the time, one thing that's been striking is we had this Hague Tribunal ruling and not a single Southeast Asian nation stood up and said we stand with the Philippines, nor were we proactive afterwards in trying to do what we normally do in other parts of the world, which is hammer out communiques that say, well, the ruling's done, can we all sign up to some sort of communique that we support the ruling?
We came out immediately with a strong statement, as did a number of countries. I was in government at the time. The outlier was the Philippines because they just had a change in government, and I think that was a surprise to almost everyone who'd been watching this so closely. And certainly amongst the other claimants within ASEAN, there was a sense that, well, we can't get out ahead of the plaintiff in this case. If the Philippines isn't standing up and championing that, how do you expect us to come out and stick our necks out, frankly, if the Philippines isn't going to stand for it? So as a result, you had sort of the ASEAN plus countries commenting on this in various fora, whether it was the Australians or the United States or the Japanese, but you didn't see the ASEAN claimants themselves standing up any further.
One thing to point out there, I think from our perspective, since we're so focused on South China Sea, for good reason, because the United States has a major interest there, which is freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas generally, I think we lose sight on how much Southeast Asia really cares about this. So half of them, care about the disputes generally. Half of them are in the group that cares. Half of them are in the group that really doesn't care at all. Okay, the claimants care. But then you have to break down the claimants and how much each of them care. And for all of them, and the Philippines is a perfect case in point at this time. They're not willing to sacrifice a relationship with China for this. It's not the major issue for them in the region or in relations with China.
Let me clarify your point. So you're saying that the Philippines and perhaps some of the other claimant nations are willing to sacrifice maritime territory and rights? Kara, go ahead. Let Walter gather his.
I think the Philippines has actually sort of navigated this narrowly, saying no. I mean, they will not sacrifice territory, and certainly the access to resources is the number one interest right now, whether it's fishing resources or hydrocarbons. So as long as they feel they've worked out an arrangement where their rights are not being infringed upon, why push the diplomatic win if they can extract, if they can derive other benefits?
China.
Yeah.
You can get that from
Right.
China.
And
Is that
so
what you're saying?
yeah, I agree. And so why press the actual territorial issue if you can manage
still
it
have
in
your
a
rights.
way? Yeah. That maintain your rights and maintain your relationship with the Chinese at the same time.
Anything I left out before we open it up to questions?
My one little comment, though, is
Yeah,
I think
please.
we have been focused on the South China Sea rightly because it has
Yeah,
been
right.
the news story.
Right.
But I think in terms of a United States strategy for Southeast Asia, the focus really has to be on trade and the economics, and frankly, the diplomatic outreach. As I wouldn't recommend very many changes to what we're doing in the security space.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay, let's open it up. Remember that rule we had? I demonstrated. Over here, sir. Yeah, microphone. One question, please, because I think we have a bunch.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Although the Asian economic crisis was 20 years ago, and of course the crisis here, 2008-9, is still in the memory of a lot of the Southeast Asian countries. And has this led, as I've heard, to an inclination on their part to not totally depend on so-called Western norms and so forth and so on, and to look to China, for example, as someone who might be able to give them a stability they didn't find in the Western economic system?
Is there a China model that they're...
Well, I mean, on the economic side, absolutely. That it still echoes the U.S. response and the Chinese, the help that the Chinese provided, not in terms of so much in terms of funds, but in terms of not devaluing yuan at the time. And you can see a little bit the same sort of dynamic now. So yeah, there's an echo of it, and there's also it playing out again, in that with the U.S. having no effective trade policy to the region, the Chinese are able to stand in as the provider of economic benefit to the region. And despite the fact that they, as we've talked about, don't offer as much as the U.S. or Japan, for that matter, in a lot of ways, they're able to use it very effectively diplomatically.
Yeah, I would add to that I think this is one reason that, like, Randy used some, I thought, very strong and very sort of clearly stated words, that the U.S. offers partnership rather than domination, which is what China offers. And I think that there's, I think in Southeast Asia, folks approach that choice with open eyes. It's just that in some of the cases, leadership doesn't mind choosing domination because they benefit from it personally at home. But if we sort of harp on that case, it's one that is a winner, I think, in much of the region.
I'd also comment that with China's economy really headed towards deep trouble over a long period of time, I think it'll be less attractive. In the back, Russell.
Thank you. Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute, and a wonderful report, Mike. It's I really can't wait to dig into all the details of this. I'd like to push the panelists, however, to focus a little bit more on the good governance aspect of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and especially because I think what I heard from Mike and Walter is that your suggestion is that the U.S. approach to governance issues should be, or democracy promotion for, not used interchangeably, but for another word, should be selective and case by case. And it seems to me that is sort of that inconsistent application of democracy promotion is one of the troubles in terms of really being having a robust policy towards Asia which supports democracy and human rights issues. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what are your thoughts then in that context of the need and perhaps the urgency now, especially in the context of the rise of authoritarian revisionist powers like China and Russia, for a league of democracy, for a coalition of democratic governments, not necessarily to promote democratization in authoritarian governments per se, but to protect against the threats of authoritarian influence operations in democracies, where we're seeing the corrosion and erosion of democratic rights and freedoms. Maybe some thoughts on that in terms of how we can really sort of put some meat on the free aspect of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. So, look, I think, first of all, U.S. democracy promotion efforts have never been quite consistent across the board. But when you look at Southeast Asia in particular, there's just a great diversity, right, in where states stand. So you have countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, which are maturing democracies. Certainly there's challenges, but things have been moving in the right direction over a long period of time. And then you have places like Vietnam and Laos, and places like Burma, where we're seeing ethnic cleansing. So of course we need specific approaches for different countries. I think what I'm getting at is when you take a place like Vietnam, who we obviously want to have a much deeper security partnership with. If we are making democratization our number one priority in that relationship, we're not going to take it where it wants to go. In fact, I would argue that deepening the relationship in other ways gives us more leverage going forward. That's not to say that we don't speak up for dissidents. We don't protest when Vietnam engages in human rights abuses. We do, but again, it's a tailored approach for the country at hand. Places like Indonesia and the Philippines will be much more open to our assistance with democratic consolidation.
Walter, let me put out a proposition, and Carrie, you can answer as well, obviously, but not if you don't want to. We are free and open and not coercive here. So the question, let me put this, we're at AI, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Dictatorships and Double Standards. I think there was some truth to that in 1979 and 1980. My read on Asian democratization, democracy promotion's gotten a bad name because of Iraq and the Arab Spring, but it was hugely successful in Asia in the 80s and 90s, right? And so, but my read was we had leverage first over these countries that democratized. So we had security leverage over South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. It all needed us because of a security threat, and we were able, after embracing and building trust, to press them. Do you agree with that read? Or?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a big contrast with today when, if you look at Cambodia and Burma, for example, where the Chinese have more leverage than we do. They can stand in and they can provide a buffer for when the U.S. stresses these concerns. And you can see it on the ground in both countries.
To build leverage first?
I think putting a democracy agenda first is not going to help us right now, even though it has been an important part and should continue to be an important part of U.S. foreign policy. But making it the number one priority, I think, is counterproductive.
But if I can just, Russell, to your point of the need for a League of Democracies, I mean, we're seeing that a bit in the reemergence of the Quad, right? I mean, I think it matters immensely that all four of these countries are mature, robust, democratic states, and so we're seeing that going forward. Where the Quad goes, I think, is an open question at this point. But the United States is always going to be more comfortable partnering with and cooperating with other democracies for a whole variety of reasons, which I think we're all familiar with.
In the back, sir. More exercise for the microphone holder.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord. I produced the TV show Civil Discord. The United States claims to abide by the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas, even though we haven't ratified it. One of the positive things that came out of the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling on the Philippines dispute was they more clearly defined what's an island entitled to an EEZ and what's just a rock that does not merit an EEZ. Do you think it would have a positive influence on claimants to features in the South and East China Sea if we set a good example by relinquishing the EEZs we claim around the Hawaiian outer island chain most of which would be classed as rocks under the Court of Arbitration ruling.
Question for Kara, I think.
Yeah, so I am not a lawyer. It is a good question. I think it's an academic and intellectually interesting question. I don't think it would have any bearing on the claimants in the South China Sea. I do think the PCA finding, which is that none of the features in the South China Sea get any easy, should help spur a decision, a resolution on the territorial dispute, because you're not disputing as much. You don't get easy with your rock, even if you've reclaimed it. So.
Yeah, I'd also point out that positive example setting approach has never worked with the Chinese. So we've been saying for decades, well, you can be in our EEZ and we don't complain. And they say, okay, great, we'll stay out of ours.
Right.
So it never works. I don't think they
Which is
generally
happening,
acknowledge
yeah.
the equivalence there.
Which is happening increasingly, and obviously we've tolerated lawfully the Russian activity in our EEZ since the Soviet times. Yes, Rachel.
Thank you. Rachel Burton with the Project 2049 Institute. I wanted to push a little bit on the comment that was made that democracy, quote unquote, democracy should not be the leading edge of U.S. strategy in the region. And I kind of want to ask the entire panel, how would you define democracy? Because there's a lot of different components to it. There's the civil society component, the human people component of it that I think is, and the trade portion of it. There's governance, there's rule of law, accountability. So there's a lot to the word democracy, and I'm worried that kind of comment kind of inherently takes out the wind of what Mike's report is trying to say of these three pillars that should drive U.S. strategy in Southeast Asia. So how would you guys all define quote unquote democracy?
That's a tough one.
Well, I'll go first. Again, the Asian democratization process has led, obviously, in Taiwan and South Korea, and in the Philippines and in Indonesia, to multi-parties, to more protection for individual rights, however imperfect, for people to have choices in who they vote for. And just the basic concept of promoting the rule of law and basic human dignity. And I think as we've saw throughout the Cold War, there's going to be different gradations of authoritarian governments as well. And I think that was the point that I think Walter was trying to make about you treat Thailand, which is not really, it's a military government, but it's not really abusive in the same sense that either Cambodia or Burma is of people's basic rights, and you think differently in your statecraft about that.
I mean, it's interesting that once you sort of throw all those elements in, accountability and elections and rule of law and everything else, and you mix them up and reassemble them, you could also come out with surprising answers. I mean, for instance, how about Singapore? Okay, now, none of us would really call Singapore a democracy, but in terms of accountability, it's more accountable than most other governments in the region in terms of rule of law, in terms of liberal freedoms in some ways. They fundamentally just don't have a chance to change the government. Philippines, you have a chance to change the government, but you don't have many of those other things. So I don't know. It's something to think through a little bit more, but it's an important question.
Okay, sorry, you go ahead.
No, I defend the fact that I was a democracy promoter in my first job after college.
Right.
So
we were all young and the lightning round. So two questions for each of you, or let's just say two last comments. What are the two big things? I asked Randy, what would success be? That, let's say, at the end of one term of this administration, you say, wow, we succeeded. Maybe we've done some of those things. Mike?
I think if we're truly successful at the end of this term, what we see, I think, in the South China Sea, I think we see China more or less adopting a freeze. So we see a halt to further military deployments and a halt to challenges of ships and aircraft operating in what we consider to be, most of the world considers to be international waters. Number two, if there's one free trade agreement by the end of this term, I'll be a happy man.
Okay, just a free trade agreement.
Yeah, that's it.
I would agree with the free trade agreement. One free trade agreement from this administration that is WTO compliant and can pass Congress, especially one that may be half Democrat for the next 2 years, would be an enormous accomplishment. So I think that's probably a good thing. I mean, on the sort of upside, on the stretch goal sort of thing, it would be to re-engage in a TPP-like process, something that's more multilateral and something that we can count on more broadly in the region.
Thanks. And by the way, I was joking about being young and a democracy supporter. I'm old and a democracy supporter, but Kara, go ahead. Two things.
So, one thing is on my mind. I'll save that for last. I think the first thing is seeing even greater cooperation and collaboration amongst the like-mindeds, if you will, the partners cooperating together in the security space. U.S. with India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, with Southeast Asian partners in Southeast Asia, coordinating on everything from capacity building to presence operations. And if the news reports are right about the current draft text for the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, that China does not succeed in putting in language that would prevent countries from exercising with the U.S. without the consensus vote of everyone else in the Code of Conduct.
The FTA is sort of a maximalist. The Code of Conduct keeping us from exercising with sort of a minimalist. But great panel. Thank you all very much. And I'm sure we'll take some of the questions I couldn't get to offline. So let's give a round of applause to Mike and Jose.